On a bitterly cold morning in December 1887, the most influential man in Pittsburgh stumbled upon something that would torment him forever. As steel magnate Cornelius Vandermark descended the marble staircase of his Fifth Avenue mansion, he was confronted by his wife's emerald evening gown, lying perfectly arranged on the Persian rug of the grand foyer, still warm to the touch as though she had just slipped out of it, yet Evangeline Vandermark herself had vanished. The front door was bolted from the inside, every window sealed tight against the Pennsylvania winter, and none of the servants had noticed anything out of the ordinary through the night. What made the disappearance even more chilling was that only 4 hours earlier, 3 different staff members had seen Evangeline retire for the night wearing that same gown. Under heavy pressure from Vandermark's powerful political allies, the Pittsburgh police shut the case after a mere 6 days, claiming there was no evidence of foul play. But the truth behind Evangeline's vanishing was darker than anyone dared imagine, involving an intricate web of industrial espionage, family betrayal, and a conspiracy that climbed to the highest rungs of Pittsburgh's gilded elite. What no one realized was that her disappearance marked the final move in a deadly contest that had been unraveling for more than 2 years. A brutal game between a woman bent on avenging her father's murder and a husband whose fortune was built on the ruins of those he destroyed. Before I take you further into the chilling saga of Evangeline Vandermark and the terrible secrets behind that night, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from, because I love hearing from people across America. Now let us return to Pittsburgh in the winter of 1887, when the city's steel barons ruled like monarchs, and murder was nothing more than another cost of doing business. At that time, Pittsburgh was at the peak of its industrial dominance, a place where fortunes were forged from steel and coal, while endless chimneys cloaked the sky in unbroken gray. The very air felt heavy with ambition and desperation, thick with smoke and the hopes of thousands of immigrants seeking their piece of the American dream in the blazing furnaces of Pennsylvania. It was a city of sharp contrasts, where magnificent mansions stood a few blocks from crumbling tenements, where a man could soar to wealth or sink into an unmarked grave in the space of months. The Vandermark mansion was a towering symbol of this new aristocracy, a 4-story Gothic revival estate stretching across an entire block of Fifth Avenue, its turrets and towers casting deep shadows over the Allegheny River. Every inch of the mansion spoke of excess, from the French-carved gargoyles to the stained glass panels that celebrated industrial triumphs, and a grand ballroom built to hold 300 of Pittsburgh's finest. Sprawled across 4 acres, the estate boasted manicured gardens, glass conservatories, outbuildings that included a carriage house for a dozen vehicles, spacious servants' quarters, and a mysterious ice house that would one day play a sinister role. Cornelius Vandermark had risen from a steel mill laborer to one of the wealthiest men in America by transforming the industry with his innovations. At 52, he was a commanding figure, his steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes betraying a mind that could see through anyone who stood in his way. Though softened by wealth, his hands still bore the scars of furnace work, a stark reminder of the brutal climb he had made through brilliance and ruthless resolve. Those who knew him when he was young often remarked on the change from an idealistic inventor who dreamed of improving workers' lives to the cold titan who later ensured the destruction of anyone daring to threaten his empire. In the savage world of 1880s, industrial America, success came to those willing to use methods far more final than competition. A suspicious fire, a sudden boiler explosion, the unexplained disappearance of a rival's chief engineer. These were his weapons in a time when government oversight was weak and lawmen could be bought with campaign donations. His 1882 marriage to Evangeline Hartwell had been the social spectacle of the decade. She was 20 years younger, the daughter of an esteemed Boston banking family, a striking figure with copper-colored hair that shimmered in the light and a laugh that could fill a ballroom. At 25, she embodied refinement and old New England wealth, fluent in French and German, a gifted pianist, and an alumna of Miss Porter's school in Connecticut. But beneath her polished charm was a keen mind and a strong moral compass that would one day set her at odds with the dark empire her husband had built. For Cornelius, their marriage was a calculated move to cement his industrial reign with the prestige of Boston's financial aristocracy. The Hartwell's connections opened the vaults of New England bankers, enabling him to expand his steel empire and absorb smaller rivals. Evangeline, meanwhile, had married believing she was joining a man whose innovations could better the lives of American workers, never suspecting that her husband viewed lives as little more than resources to be spent in the relentless pursuit of power. By the winter of 1887, those closest to the Vandermarks whispered that cracks had formed in the seemingly perfect facade of their marriage. Evangeline, once the vibrant heart of Pittsburgh's high society, had become withdrawn, spending long hours in the mansion's vast library, where she filled a leather-bound journal that she locked inside her desk, the tiny brass key always hanging from a chain around her neck. The library was a grand room of towering shelves crammed with more than 3,000 volumes, ranging from first editions of literary works to scientific treatises, and a specialized collection of books on America's industrial rise that she had carefully built since arriving in Pittsburgh. The staff of 12 loyal and carefully chosen had noticed she now wandered off for solitary walks at strange hours, often returning with mud-streaked boots and a haunted look in her striking green eyes. Her steps often led her through the city's poorest districts, where she spoke with the wives and children of mill workers, quietly collecting their stories of dangerous conditions and fatal accidents that seemed to shadow her husband's expanding empire. What none of them knew was that these seemingly harmless visits formed part of her secret investigation into the trail of destruction left wherever Cornelius Vandermark extended his reach. The household itself was run with unwavering discipline. Margaret Sullivan, the sharp-witted Irish housekeeper who had come from County Cork during the famine years, kept the estate running with perfect order and would later become a key witness to the events that would follow. Thomas Brennan, the Scottish groundskeeper who had fled poverty with his family in 1868, cared for the sprawling gardens and grounds with such precision that even the smallest disturbance stood out to him. And in time he would discover unsettling signs that the estate had been used for purposes no one suspected. Charles Henley, the impeccable butler trained in Philadelphia under English traditions of service, knew more than anyone about the secrets whispered behind the mansion's heavy doors. And even his calm professionalism would falter as strange, chilling occurrences unfolded in the months before Evangeline's disappearance. Dr. Franklin Westbrook, the family physician for over 5 years, had grown increasingly alarmed by her declining health, and his private notes hinted at severe marital tensions draining her strength and spirit. These were people who lived by a strict code of loyalty and discretion, which made her vanishing seem even more incomprehensible, given that life within the mansion functioned with the precision of a clock. Every servant performing duties on schedule in a world where it was almost impossible for anyone to come or go unnoticed. To outsiders, the mystery of her disappearance would come to seem supernatural. The city itself felt tense that winter, as though the smoke-filled sky carried the weight of unrest. Labor strikes were spreading through the industrial cities of America after the bloody Haymarket riots in Chicago, and Pittsburgh's own workers had begun demanding safer conditions and fairer wages, sparking growing anger among the elite. Beneath these tensions ran hushed rumors of a clandestine brotherhood of industrialists, sworn to maintain their grip on power at any cost, even if it meant removing anyone who stood in their way. On the evening of December 12, 1887, the day began as uneventfully as any other in the Vandermark household, governed by the strict routines that had been unbroken for over 5 years. Margaret Sullivan later told police that at exactly 7 o'clock, she served dinner to Mr. and Mrs. Vandermark in the grand dining room, a space of decadent Victorian luxury, dominated by a massive mahogany table capable of seating 24, lit by a crystal chandelier imported from Bohemia and surrounded by paintings of industrial victories Cornelius himself had commissioned. That evening's meal featured roasted pheasant greenhouse-grown winter vegetables and a bottle of 1878 Chateau Margaux from Cornelius's private cellar, a single bottle worth more than a mill worker's monthly wages. Margaret recalled that Evangeline barely touched her food, answering her husband's conversation only with soft murmurs and distracted nods, and that she repeatedly cast anxious glances toward the frost-rimmed windows as if expecting someone to appear out of the snowy darkness. She looked, the housekeeper said later, like a woman memorizing the room as if knowing it would be the last time she saw it. Cornelius, by contrast, was unusually animated, boasting about a lucrative contract with the Pennsylvania Railroad and his plans to expand into Ohio and West Virginia. Yet even as he talked with apparent cheer, Charles Henley quietly noted the way his employer's hand kept drifting to his pocket watch, checking it over and over between bites of pheasant. His behavior carried the unsettling air of a man waiting for a predetermined moment to arrive. At precisely 9:30 that night, Margaret had helped Evangeline prepare for bed, guiding her into the emerald silk evening gown she favored for entertaining guests, even though there were no visitors expected. That single choice would later puzzle investigators, since she usually retired in far simpler attire, and the lavish Parisian gown, with its shimmering beadwork, imported at a staggering cost of nearly $500, seemed wildly out of place for an ordinary evening at home. Margaret remembered complimenting the delicate detailing of the gown, and for the first time in weeks, Evangeline smiled a genuine soft smile that briefly lit up her face. Yet with that fleeting moment came something far heavier. Evangeline embraced her housekeeper with surprising intensity, whispering, "Thank you for your kindness, Margaret. You have been like a mother to me all these years." At the time, it seemed an unexpected show of affection. But later Margaret understood it had felt like a farewell. She looked almost at peace, Margaret recalled, like a weight had finally been lifted. But there was sadness too, as if she knew she was about to lose everything she loved. That evening, Margaret also noticed a new piece of jewelry, a silver locket on a thin chain decorated with intricate Celtic knotwork. When asked about it, Evangeline simply said it contained something precious that needed to be kept safe, but she would not open it or explain further. At 11:00, while making his final rounds of the estate, Thomas Brennan spotted a faint light glowing from Evangeline's private study on the second floor. Through the frost-glazed window, he could make out her silhouette hunched over the writing desk, her pen racing across paper with an intensity that struck him as frantic rather than composed. It was the last confirmed sighting of Evangeline Vandermark alive. Inside that study, she was completing the most important work of her life, a detailed account of her husband's crimes and the bloody conspiracy known as the Pittsburgh Circle. Around her, months of careful research had transformed the room into an archive of secrets. Hidden behind books were photographs, letters, and evidence linking Cornelius and his allies to dozens of so-called industrial accidents. Maps of Pennsylvania and the neighboring states were marked with red pins, each one denoting the death of a rival or a competitor's sudden ruin. And next to each pin were notes describing the circumstances and the men who profited from their demise. By dawn the next morning, the mansion had fallen silent. At 6:00, Margaret came to begin her duties, and found the front door still locked from within its heavy iron bolt firmly in place. As she had been trained, she checked every ground floor window herself. All were sealed unbroken and secured with locks that showed no tampering. The upper windows were unreachable without ladders, and Thomas confirmed that every ladder remained untouched in the carriage house, a fresh layer of night snow lying undisturbed on them. Outside, the snow told a story of its own, a flawless sheet of white without a single footprint or track. If anyone had left the house, they had done so without touching the earth. But it was the sight awaiting Margaret in the grand foyer that froze her in place and brought Henley running. Spread out with ceremonial care on the Persian rug was Evangeline's emerald gown, still warm, when Margaret's hand brushed against it, and the soft fragrance of her lavender perfume lingered in the cold air, as if she had only just stepped away. The gown was perfectly arranged, its delicate beadwork intact, the buttons undone with meticulous care, no damage to the fabric. Next to it, a torn page from Evangeline's journal bore only 4 haunting words in her own hand. The truth must survive. More disturbing details became apparent in those frantic first minutes. There was a faint discoloration in the rug beneath the gown, as though something had been cleaned or treated there. Along with the lingering scent of lavender came a faint medicinal odor that Thomas later compared to the chemicals used in hospitals to sedate patients. Lying on the marble floor beside the gown was her extravagant wedding ring, a priceless diamond encircled by emeralds. But the silver locket Margaret had noticed only hours earlier was missing. It was as if whoever had taken Evangeline had cared only about that one object, leaving jewels of far greater value untouched. When Cornelius was roused and led into the foyer, the servants were unsettled, not by panic, but by his reaction. He stood silently staring at the gown for long minutes, not with shock or grief, but with a look Margaret later described as pure fear, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. His face drained of color, but it was the pallor of a man bracing for a crisis he had long anticipated, rather than the shock of sudden tragedy. Stranger still was Cornelius's immediate response to the scene. Instead of calling for the police or ordering a frantic search of the house, the very first thing he did was send Charles Henley to summon his private secretary, Arthur Peaton, a nervous man entrusted with Vandermark's most sensitive business affairs. His second order was directed at Margaret. She was to collect every personal paper and journal from Evangeline's study, an act that seemed far more concerned with controlling what evidence existed than finding his missing wife. When Dr. Franklin Westbrook arrived an hour later, Cornelius had already taken complete control. The physician was not allowed to examine the room or advise on what might have happened. Instead, he was escorted to Vandermark's private office for a closed-door conversation, lasting half an hour, after which Westbrook emerged visibly shaken and refused to discuss the matter with anyone. Outside, Thomas Brennan made a grim discovery that same morning. Though the snow around the mansion remained perfectly undisturbed, he noticed something unusual near the old ice house, dark stains partially concealed beneath a fine layer of fresh snow that looked very much like blood. When he tried to investigate, Cornelius himself intervened, forbidding him to approach the structure and claiming it was dangerously unstable. From that moment on, the ice house was declared off-limits to all household staff. The official police investigation into Evangeline Vandermark's disappearance lasted only 6 days, a shockingly short time for a case involving such a powerful family. Detective Samuel Crawford, a seasoned officer with 20 years of service, was assigned to lead the inquiry, but quickly discovered that every step he took was met with invisible resistance. In his private notes, Crawford later described interference from forces unknown that dogged his efforts from the very beginning. Known in Pittsburgh for his relentless pursuit of truth and unwillingness to accept easy explanations, Crawford was a tall, wiry man with prematurely gray hair and piercing eyes. He had built a career on solving the city's most complex crimes through sheer persistence. But the Vandermark case would prove to be unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was a mystery that defied logic, while hinting at a conspiracy so vast and deeply entrenched that even acknowledging its existence would put his life in jeopardy. During his interviews with the household staff, Crawford learned disturbing details that never appeared in the official police record. Margaret revealed that in the weeks before she vanished, Evangeline had been receiving secret visitors. Distinguished, well-dressed men who arrived under the cover of darkness and slipped into the mansion through the service entrance. They always met her in the privacy of her study, leaving before sunrise without being seen by anyone outside the trusted staff. After these visits, Margaret noticed Evangeline seemed more agitated, frightened, and determined. The visitors were unmistakable educated accents, expensive coats, the easy confidence of men accustomed to power, and eyes that Margaret described as cold and calculating, scanning everything around them as if weighing threats and escape routes. Thomas Brennan provided another piece of the puzzle when he told Crawford about the strange activity he had observed around the old ice house, a long-abandoned stone building set into the hillside behind the mansion. Though refrigeration had made it obsolete years earlier, the structure was solid built, with 3-foot-thick walls and a system of drains that kept it dry and cool year-round. Throughout November and early December, Thomas had often seen fresh footprints in the snow leading to and from the ice house. They were the small, narrow prints of a woman's boots, the same size and style as those in Evangeline's wardrobe. More troubling still, he admitted that on several nights there had been 2 sets of prints, hers coming from the mansion, and another set much larger, coming from the public road. Whoever left those heavier tracks had worn boots like those of a laborer or workman. On those nights, Thomas sometimes saw a faint flicker of lantern light inside the ice house, suggesting that some secret meeting or task was taking place within. Determined to examine the building himself, Crawford requested entry, but Vandermark firmly refused, claiming the structure was unsafe. The explanation struck Crawford as implausible, especially given the sturdiness of the stonework, but any attempt to press the issue met with swift legal pushback. Vandermark's lawyers insisted that the ice house was private property and that a formal warrant was required. When Crawford finally returned with the paperwork 3 days later, he found the entrance sealed. Fresh mortar had been applied over the doors and windows, and Vandermark's attorneys argued that because the structure had been materially altered, the warrant was now invalid. It was the first time in Crawford's long career that he faced such blatant obstruction, and it convinced him that the disappearance of Evangeline Vandermark was part of something much darker than a simple missing persons case. The speed with which the ice house had been sealed was staggering. The work of skilled masons completed overnight, with a large quantity of stone and mortar that must have been delivered and used under the cover of darkness. But the most disturbing discovery came when Crawford learned that Evangeline's leather-bound journal, the same one servants had seen her writing in obsessively, was missing from her locked desk. The desk itself was untouched, its lock undamaged, and the only key had been around Evangeline's neck the night she vanished. Cornelius denied knowing of any such book, even though Margaret swore under oath that she had seen him reading from it on that very morning. Witnesses described the journal as much more than personal thoughts. Margaret reported that it was filled with precise notes, sketches, records of meetings, and what looked like sensitive correspondence, the result of at least 6 months of relentless documentation. When Crawford turned his attention to Evangeline's family, he uncovered a history filled with ruin and tragedy. The Hartwells, once pillars of Boston banking, had fallen from wealth to near poverty in just 5 years due to a rapid series of financial disasters. The decline was suspiciously swift and carefully engineered. Her father, Harrison Hartwell, had been found dead in 1886, officially ruled a suicide by hanging, though no note was found, and friends insisted he had shown no sign of despair. The Boston police file on his death was paper thin, just a brief report and a coroner's note. But Crawford's inquiries uncovered whispers in banking circles that Harrison had been on the verge of exposing a massive steel industry fraud involving insider manipulation of stock prices linked to deliberate industrial accidents. The conspiracy, he was told, revolved around a group of Pittsburgh industrialists who profited by engineering disasters that destroyed rivals and let them buy assets at pennies on the dollar. Equally troubling was the fate of Evangeline's younger brother Edmund. After their father's death, he was said to have left for California in late 1886 to make his fortune. But no one could give details, and no one had heard from him since. Records revealed that a man matching Edmund's description had bought a train ticket to Chicago that November, but there was no evidence he ever traveled farther west. He stayed in several Chicago hotels through that winter, paying cash, and never staying in one place long, using an alias that barely disguised his name. Then he vanished without a trace. Following the money trail, Crawford found that the Hartwell downfall was part of a larger, deliberate pattern: manipulated stocks, fraudulent loans, and hostile takeovers timed precisely to leave the family exposed. The timeline of these attacks lined up almost perfectly with Cornelius Vandermark's courtship of Evangeline, suggesting their marriage was as much a calculated move to neutralize a threat as it was a means of gaining legitimacy among Boston's financial elite. As Crawford dug deeper, he uncovered a disturbing network of similar cases throughout New England and the Mid-Atlantic. Prominent families who had ties to steel or insider knowledge of industrial corruption had been systematically destroyed. Their businesses swallowed up by companies connected to a small circle of Pittsburgh power brokers. Again and again, misfortune struck in the form of financial collapse, mysterious fires, fatal accidents, or suicides. In his private notes, Crawford began to refer to the hidden organization behind these events as the Pittsburgh Circle, an elite brotherhood who had eliminated at least 37 people over the past decade to secure their stranglehold over America's steel empire. The methods were varied: suspicious explosions, factory fires, manipulated bank crashes, convenient suicides, and vanishings that left no evidence behind. But the result was always the same: their rivals disappeared, and their influence grew. 3 months after Evangeline's disappearance, Pittsburgh was shaken by a devastating explosion at Consolidated Steelworks, the largest plant owned by Cornelius's chief competitor, Henry Rutherford. In the early hours of a bitter March morning, an enormous blast ripped through the factory, killing 17 workers and reducing half the plant to ruins. Officially, it was blamed on a defective boiler. But the timing raised suspicions. Several of Rutherford's most important engineers and foremen had been working late on confidential production changes that night. Men who rarely stayed past dusk. In the city's working-class neighborhoods, the whispers were immediate and grim. This had not been an accident at all, but a warning. The latest act of sabotage in a secret war that was claiming lives in the shadows. The devastation at the Consolidated Steelworks bore little resemblance to a conventional industrial accident, for investigators found signs that the explosion had ignited from several points at once, rather than a single failed boiler. Even more alarming was evidence, quietly suppressed by company officials and local authorities, that many of the plant's safety systems had been deliberately disabled in the hours leading up to the blast. It was a watchman named Patrick O'Connell who brought to Detective Crawford the most extraordinary discovery tied to that night. A discovery that drew a direct line back to Evangeline Vandermark, O'Connell, an Irish immigrant who had patrolled the mill for 3 years, stumbled across a charred leather satchel half buried under the wreckage of the office building while helping clear debris. Inside were scorched documents that laid out vulnerabilities in several Pittsburgh mills, complete with engineering drawings and notes that looked like a timetable of accidents yet to come. The elegant feminine handwriting on many of these papers was immediately recognized by Margaret Sullivan as Evangeline's. These pages were not the work of a casual observer. They revealed months, perhaps years of careful research floor plans, annotated with details about shifts, security routines, and equipment failures. Sketches and photographs taken secretly within the factories, and margin notes about the best ways to bring these industrial giants to their knees. Even more shocking was a series of letters tucked among the diagrams, urgent conspiratorial correspondence between someone signing only EV and another referred to as EH. These letters spoke of a plan to expose the circle and bring justice for Father and Crawford. Comparing the handwriting, confirmed that EV's script matched Evangeline's. The counterpart's hand, firm and methodical, seemed that of a legally trained man, fueling Crawford's suspicion that Edmund Hartwell was alive and secretly helping his sister. O'Connell, trusting Crawford's reputation, turned the satchel over in secret, knowing that if Vandermark's allies discovered it, he would not live long enough to testify. As Crawford studied these documents, he saw in them not just proof of sabotage, but the outlines of an even greater truth. The explosion at Consolidated Steelworks was part of a calculated chain of industrial strikes. Over the previous 18 months, 7 different steel mills, coal mines, and manufacturing plants across Pennsylvania had been destroyed by accidents that all shared a chilling consistency. In every case, the victimized facility belonged to or was about to be acquired by one of Cornelius Vandermark's competitors, and each disaster struck at a moment of maximum vulnerability when debts mounted or workers were threatening strike. The more Crawford pieced the pattern together, the clearer it became the Pittsburgh Circle was waging a silent war for absolute control of the state's economy, using arson bombs and murder as business tactics. Their goal was not simply to remove rivals, but to dominate steel, coal, and transportation so completely that they could dictate the industrial future of the nation. They had built what amounted to a shadow government. Steel barons, coal magnates, railroad bosses, lawyers, bankers, and politicians moved as one, insulated by bribery and intimidation. Their influence extended into the press, which they used to shape narratives, minimize the human cost of accidents, and bury any hint of sabotage. Judges, police chiefs, and even state officials were on their payroll, ensuring that inconvenient investigations were quietly closed and that witnesses either recanted or disappeared. Beneath them, a network of ex-soldiers, private detectives, and hired killers did the dirtiest work, carrying out orders in ways that left no thread leading back to the men in the circle. From his deep dive into the Hartwell family history, Crawford came to understand that Harrison Hartwell had uncovered the early signs of this machine 15 years earlier while investigating suspicious steel investments for his Boston clients. He had been poised to expose the circle when he was murdered and made to look like a suicide. Edmund Hartwell, who had been working alongside him, narrowly escaped fleeing Boston before the circle's agents could silence him as well. Evangeline, years later, had married Vandermark, only to discover that her father's death and her family's ruin were no accidents. Piece by piece, she had pieced together their crimes from within their inner sanctum, her late-night visitors almost certainly allies in her effort to collect evidence. Crawford now suspected that one of these allies was none other than Edmund himself. But the revelation that shook the detective most of all came when he began tracing the web of properties linked to the circle. Shell companies' fronts for Vandermark and his associates had been quietly buying up key pieces of land around Pittsburgh and beyond. locations that tied directly to the places where explosions, fires, and fatal accidents had cleared the way for the Circle's empire to grow. These records, he realized, were more than real estate transactions. They were a blueprint for the systematic conquest of Pennsylvania's industry, and Evangeline had very nearly uncovered the entire plan before she disappeared. One of the most revealing properties linked to the Pittsburgh Circle was a secluded farmhouse in Westmoreland County, about 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Purchased in 1886, just as cracks began to appear in the Vandermark marriage, the estate served as a private retreat away from the watchful eyes of Pittsburgh's social elite. When Detective Crawford made a discreet visit there in late April 1888, he found clear signs of recent habitation dust, disturbed on tabletops, food supplies replenished, and a general air that someone had been using the house as a hideout. Though modest in size, the farmhouse had been outfitted with extraordinary care, reinforced doors, heavy shutters, and even hidden passages connecting rooms as if it had been designed to withstand a siege. It was in the small study that Crawford realized the full significance of this place. The walls were plastered with maps of Pennsylvania, marked with pins for industrial accidents, newspaper clippings of fires and explosions, and hand-drawn family trees linking the city's most powerful industrial families. At the center of it all was a massive chart, a web of names and companies that Crawford would later describe as a spider of corruption, showing exactly how Vandermark's empire had expanded through calculated destruction. The evidence collected in that study was overwhelming photographs, financial records, and correspondence proving beyond doubt the existence of the Pittsburgh Circle. There were ledgers showing how steel prices had been manipulated, letters between conspirators discussing who to eliminate next, and even photographs taken covertly of Circle meetings in which Cornelius Vandermark and his peers could be seen plotting acts of sabotage and terror. But the most chilling discovery lay below the farmhouse. In the cellar behind a false wall, Crawford uncovered a hidden chamber. There, dozens more documents and photographs revealed that the Circle's crimes extended far beyond industrial sabotage. These files detailed political assassinations, bribery of judges, the silencing of journalists, and the systematic targeting of labor leaders. Among these was a single photograph that shook Crawford to his core. The interior of the Consolidated Steelworks boiler room, marked with red ink on key structural points. Written in the margins, in Evangeline's own elegant hand, were instructions describing how to maximize the blast's destruction. The photograph was dated November 15th, 1887, less than a month before her disappearance and months before the explosion that killed 17 men. At first glance, the evidence suggested Evangeline's involvement. But as Crawford read deeper into the documents, the terrible truth came into focus. She had been coerced. Letters and notes revealed that the Circle had discovered her secret investigation and had taken her missing brother Edmund hostage. They forced her to supply them with intelligence about their competitors, using Edmund's life as leverage. While outwardly complying, Evangeline had been secretly documenting everything, creating an archive that, if revealed, could destroy the Circle. Hidden in the farmhouse was also a series of letters between Evangeline and a man who signed only with the initials EHI letters that proved Edmund was alive, living under an assumed identity and helping her from the shadows. Together, they had been building a case, waiting for the right moment to expose the Circle. The final letter, dated December 10th, 1887, 2 days before Evangeline vanished, contained a desperate warning. It began. Our father's death was not suicide. C knows that we have discovered the truth about the Circle. They plan to eliminate both of us within days. I have hidden copies of all evidence in multiple locations. If something happens to me, Remember our childhood hiding place. The truth waits there. Do not trust anyone in Pittsburgh. The corruption reaches into the highest levels of government. Trust only the contact in Chicago whose name I gave you. Time is running out. V. Accompanying the letter was a map of the Vandermark estate with specific marks showing the locations of hidden caches of evidence. One mark was on the old ice house, the very building Cornelius had kept locked and guarded. In that moment, Crawford understood the reason for Evangeline's repeated visits to the ice house. She had been hiding her evidence there, not meeting co-conspirators. She had discovered that her marriage was a trap, that her father's death and her family's ruin had been orchestrated, and instead of running, she chose to fight. She used her position as Cornelius's wife to infiltrate the circle, gathering every document she could, all while pretending to be complicit. It was the most dangerous game imaginable. But as Crawford prepared to retrieve the evidence she had hidden, the circle turned its gaze on him. He began to notice strangers watching his boarding house. His mail arrived, opened and resealed, and his most trusted witnesses recanted their statements out of fear. Then, just as he closed in on the final pieces of the puzzle, the conspiracy struck. On a rainy April morning in 1888, Detective Samuel Crawford was found dead in an alley behind the Pittsburgh Central Police Station. The official verdict was a heart attack brought on by drink, yet those who knew him insisted he barely drank and was in good health. More telling was the disappearance of every file related to the Vandermark case from the police archives on the very same night. Crawford's death ended the last official attempt to solve Evangeline Vandermark's disappearance, and it sent a message as clear as any signed threat. In the months that followed, the city's industrial elite closed ranks even tighter, creating an atmosphere of suffocating fear. Among the mills and in the dark corners of taverns, workers whispered of accidents that silenced those who spoke out, and of a power so vast that even the bravest policeman could not hope to stand against it. In the months following Crawford's death, the press in Pittsburgh fell under an eerie silence. Journalists quickly discovered that their editors had no interest in stories that cast the city's industrial titans in a negative light. Articles were spiked without explanation, and even the most outspoken advocates of labor reform among Pittsburgh's politicians began reversing their positions, offering vague statements about economic stability and the importance of maintaining the city's national advantage. Yet beneath this carefully maintained calm, the detective's unfinished work was already spreading beyond the city. Before his death, Crawford had corresponded with trusted contacts in other cities, sharing details about the patterns of suspicious industrial accidents and unexplained disappearances. These letters, which left behind a breadcrumb trail of evidence, prompted several quiet investigations in distant cities. In Boston, Captain William O'Brien, a 25-year veteran of the police force, reopened the files on the 1886 death of Harrison Hartwell, a case that had been uncomfortably closed within days of the banker's body being discovered in his office. The official verdict had been suicide, but the scene told another story: scattered papers, overturned furniture, and a watchman's ignored testimony of 3 well-dressed men leaving the building. O'Brien, always troubled by these details, dug deeper, discovering that no record existed of Edmund Hartwell's arrival in California, despite family claims that he had traveled there after his father's death. Instead, scattered reports from the Midwest told of a young lawyer, using assumed names, moving from city to city, asking pointed questions about industrial corruption. Meanwhile, in Chicago, investigative journalist Michael Flanagan of the Tribune was drawn into the mystery. Flanagan, already known for exposing political graft and corporate abuses, had begun investigating the same patterns of industrial accidents that Crawford had tracked in Pennsylvania. His work revealed a chilling national pattern. Cleveland, Detroit, and other booming industrial cities showed evidence of similar conspiracies with influential business leaders secretly coordinating to remove competition and expand their reach. These findings convinced him that the Pittsburgh Circle was part of a much larger, interconnected network. Through a careful chain of intermediaries and coded correspondence, Flanagan managed to make contact with the elusive E.H., whose initials had been found in Evangeline's letters. The meeting, arranged in a deserted warehouse on Chicago's South Side, brought him face to face with Edmund Hartwell, very much alive, but living under a false identity. For more than a year, Edmund had been moving from city to city, abandoning any hope of practicing law, hiding from the very men who had killed his father and ruined his family. From the moment he fled Boston, he had been gathering evidence, and what he revealed to Flanagan that night reshaped the journalist's understanding of the conspiracy. The Pittsburgh Circle, Edmund explained, was no local cabal. It was a vast, secret network of industrialists, bankers, railroad magnates, lawyers, and politicians, some at the very highest levels of power, including senators, federal judges, newspaper publishers, and cabinet members. For over a decade, they had acted as a shadow government engineering events that shaped the American economy in their favor. Their influence was everywhere. They had manipulated the Panic of 1873, deliberately triggering a collapse to buy assets for pennies on the dollar. They had incited and then crushed labor strikes, using violence and federal troops to break unions. And they had influenced legislation, tariffs, and even foreign policy for their own gain. Among Edmund's evidence was proof that they had arranged targeted assassinations, made enemies disappear, and silenced anyone who might threaten them. The most personal revelation came when Edmund finally told Flanagan what had happened to his sister. Evangeline had not simply vanished on December 12, 1887. She had been murdered by her husband Cornelius Vandermark with the assistance of other Circle members after she threatened to take their secrets to federal authorities. Her investigation had brought her too close to the heart of the conspiracy, and her death was intended to close the Circle forever. Yet she had outwitted them in one final act. Before she died, Evangeline had hidden copies of her evidence in multiple locations. It was, Edmund said, their insurance policy, a fail-safe that ensured that even if both siblings were killed, the truth would eventually surface. That evidence included everything from financial records and internal correspondence to photographs of secret meetings and even audio recordings made with a newly invented phonograph, capturing incriminating conversations. Evangeline had also compiled a list of surviving victims and witnesses who could testify if protected. Edmund described how he and his sister had designed a plan to bring down the Circle by releasing their evidence simultaneously to newspapers, law enforcement, and political leaders across several major cities, overwhelming the organization's ability to silence the truth. That plan had died with her, at least for now. But in the darkness of that abandoned warehouse, as rain drummed on the roof, Edmund Hartwell made Flanagan promise that the work Evangeline had begun would not end with her murder. They had known from the beginning that the true strength of the Pittsburgh Circle came not from its money or influence, but from its absolute control of information and its ruthless efficiency in eliminating anyone who threatened to reveal the truth. Evangeline and Edmund had planned their final strike around this fact. A massive coordinated release of evidence to newspapers, law enforcement agencies, and political leaders across multiple cities, at the same time overwhelming the Circle's ability to silence every witness or destroy every document. But their careful plan was discovered before it could be set into motion. On the night of December 12, 1887, Cornelius Vandermark learned of Evangeline's efforts. Instead of the calm conversation she had hoped might sway him to abandon the conspiracy, he came to her study in a rage, entering without a knock at exactly 11:47 p.m. Behind him stood two men she recognized from society dinners, men she now knew to be members of the Circle. Cornelius held in his hands the proof of her betrayal, stolen documents, photographs, and her correspondence with Edmund. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out about your little investigation?" he asked quietly, his voice more chilling than any shout. For Evangeline, the confrontation marked the end. She had spent months preparing for this moment, hiding her evidence in caches around the estate, and in other locations, knowing that Edmund would carry on their work if she did not survive. But the moment itself, facing the man she had once loved and realizing that he would kill her, was far more terrifying than she had imagined. Hours before this confrontation, Edmund had received a coded telegram from his sister, warning that their plan had been compromised and urging him to enact the emergency procedures they had devised. By the time he read her message, it was already too late. If he tried to reach her, both of them would die. The only choice he had left was to protect the evidence. While Evangeline fought for her life in Pittsburgh, Edmund made sure that their work would not die with her. When Flanagan met Edmund decades later in a Chicago warehouse, the younger Hartwell spoke of that night with a voice heavy with guilt. As they talked, the meeting was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of boots in the corridor and the metallic click of revolvers being drawn. They had been found. The Circle's agents had tracked Edmund even here. In those desperate seconds before their attackers struck, Edmund thrust a leather portfolio into Flanagan's hands, whispering that it contained maps to the caches of evidence Evangeline had hidden and the names of those who could testify if given protection. Then began a frantic chase through Chicago's darkened streets, pursued by men who seemed to appear out of every alleyway. Only a combination of luck, Edmund's knowledge of the city, and the help of sympathetic workers enabled them to escape. By dawn, both men knew the cost of their survival. They were now hunted, their lives changed forever, carrying knowledge of a conspiracy powerful enough to destroy them at any moment. In that portfolio, Flanagan now held the single greatest threat to the Pittsburgh Circle, a threat that, if used correctly, could bring the truth to light. For more than 3 decades after Evangeline's murder, that truth lay hidden, sealed away in caches that no one dared retrieve. Cornelius Vandermark's power only grew after her death. By the 1890s, he was one of the most respected industrialists in the country, holding seats on the boards of banks and railroads. Outwardly, he wore the mask of a grieving widower, refusing to remarry, and claiming the loss of Evangeline had shattered him. While in private, he grew more paranoid, covering his home in new locks, surrounding himself with security, and isolating himself from those who had once been close to him. Then in 1921, nearly 2 decades after his death, the truth finally began to surface. The Vandermark mansion sold. After Cornelius died in 1903, was being renovated when a construction crew noticed that the dimensions of the library did not match the building's exterior walls. Behind the carved oak paneling, they found a hidden chamber, an 8 by 12-foot room that had been sealed since the 1880s. Shelves lined the walls filled with documents, maps, photographs, and a small desk under a ventilation shaft that had preserved everything. It was Evangeline's secret archive, a room built as both a hiding place and a vault to ensure that even in death, her evidence would one day be found. Within that sealed space lay the entire record of her investigation, proof of the crimes of the Pittsburgh Circle, and the final chance for the world to learn the truth about what happened on that cold night in December 1887. Inside the hidden chamber lay more than 200 pieces of evidence, documents, photographs, and personal letters that told in devastating detail the story of a decades-long campaign of murder and sabotage carried out by Cornelius Vandermark and the Pittsburgh Circle. Evangeline had spent months recording every facet of the conspiracy, and what she had left behind was so thorough and damning that it would have been enough to convict dozens of the country's most powerful men had it come to light during their lifetimes. The papers included ledgers that traced how the circle profited from orchestrating disasters at rival factories, short-selling their stocks, and using the resulting windfalls to finance bribes, blackmail, and the killers who enforced their power. Photographs secretly taken with a concealed camera during gatherings at the Vandermark mansion revealed men of industry and politics in unguarded moments plotting sabotage and the deaths of those who stood in their way. There was no mistaking the faces captured on those plates or the conversations immortalized in Evangeline's precise notes. The most haunting find of all was her red leather journal. Page after page detailed her growing horror as she uncovered the full scale of the crimes tied to her husband, her resolve strengthening with every entry. The final pages, written the very night she disappeared, showed her trembling script as she described confronting Cornelius, naively, believing that she could appeal to whatever humanity remained in him. Instead, he mocked her. He admitted that the ruin of her family had been calculated to warn others that their marriage had been a move to neutralize a threat, and that now she had outlived her usefulness. He gave her what he called a choice: accept a false identity and vanish from the world, or join the others who had been silenced. The journal revealed that Evangeline and Edmund had long planned for this moment. Together they had prepared a way to fake her death, using the mansion's hidden servant passages to disappear, while evidence of her life's work was left behind in the house to be discovered later. The emerald gown she left in the foyer was meant to distract a theatrical symbol to confuse investigators while she slipped away through tunnels. But Cornelius knew every hidden corridor better than anyone. He had commissioned their construction. As her journal ended mid-sentence, she described hearing footsteps and low voices, realizing too late that she had been betrayed and that her escape route had been cut off. In those last frantic moments, she carried her archive to the concealed chamber behind the library, hoping she could lock herself inside, wait until the house fell quiet, and escape later. The workers who broke open that chamber in 1921 discovered the tragic outcome of that final desperate gamble. Behind piles of collapsed shelves and dusty curtains lay the skeletal remains of a woman in the tattered remnants of an emerald gown. Beside her was a silver locket containing a photograph of her father and the inscription, "To my beloved daughter Evangeline, may you always fight for justice, no matter the cost." 1882. The coroner's examination revealed fractures in her skull and marks on her arms that spoke of a violent struggle. Scratches on the brick walls told the rest she had been walled in alive, entombed by the men who had come for her. Her last act was to scratch a message into the wooden floor with a shard of jewelry. Edmund. The circle continues. Stop them. Justice for father. Evie, 1887. The discovery of her remains and the treasure trove of evidence changed everything. No longer a whispered rumor, the Pittsburgh Circle was suddenly exposed in a scandal that shook the nation. Federal agents, under the direction of Attorney General Harry Dogie, took over the case, bypassing Pittsburgh's corrupt authorities entirely. The evidence tied dozens of powerful families to a long chain of murders, financial crimes, and sabotage, reaching as far back as the early 1870s. It was revealed that the Circle had been responsible for at least 93 deaths over 30 years, killing rivals, silencing journalists, eliminating reformers, and even murdering police who came too close to their secrets. Their methods were as varied as they were cold factory fires, staged as accidents, engineered boiler explosions, poisonings masked as illness assassinations made to look like robberies. The revelations sent shockwaves through the industrial world, showing that the corruption and violence that had fueled Pittsburgh's meteoric rise were not unique to one city. Similar networks were uncovered in other centers of American industry. But it was Evangeline's archive that finally pulled back the curtain on the shadow empire that had ruled unchecked for decades. Her sacrifice, her lonely fight for justice sealed behind brick and oak, became the spark that forced a reckoning long overdue. The federal investigation confirmed that the Pittsburgh Circle had never been a purely local phenomenon. What Evangeline uncovered was the hub of a nationwide network of interlocking conspiracies that had shaped American industrial growth from the shadows for decades. The reach of these secret alliances extended far beyond Pennsylvania's steel mills, touching everything from labor policy to trade regulations, stock markets, and the very laws meant to protect the public. When investigators finally located Edmund Hartwell, now living under the name Edward Harrison in Los Angeles, he confirmed what his sister's hidden archive had already revealed. He explained that he and Evangeline had been working with a scattered group of reformist journalists and a few honest law enforcement officials, hoping to expose the circle. But one by one, their allies had either disappeared or died in sudden suspicious accidents, leaving the two siblings isolated. She knew that night was a trap, Edmund admitted in 1921. His voice heavy with guilt and grief, even after more than 30 years in hiding. She went into it believing that if she could not survive, the truth would. Everything we did was for that. His testimony allowed federal investigators to map out a hidden world that had thrived under the surface of American progress. Their search led to caches of evidence hidden across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, and to the rediscovery of Samuel Crawford's private notes, painstakingly preserved by his widow, despite repeated threats from unknown men demanding she destroy them. These papers revealed that Crawford had been far closer to the truth than anyone realized, and that his death in 1888 had been an assassination carried out with a poison designed to mimic heart failure. The scandal that followed the unsealing of Evangeline's chamber and the corroborating testimony from Edmund shook the foundations of American government and business. For the first time, federal investigators laid out the full scope of the Circle's operations. Senators, congressmen, judges, and even senior federal officials implicated as either direct collaborators or bought and paid for allies of the conspiracy. The result was the largest corruption inquiry in the country's history up to that time, and the forced resignation of dozens of prominent figures. By 1923, the Vandermark mansion itself was demolished officially for structural reasons, though many believed it was to wipe away the memory of what had been found within its walls. The site became a small public park, marked by a modest memorial to victims of Pittsburgh's early industrial violence, a plaque that did not mention Evangeline or the Circle, a final concession to the families whose influence still lingered over the city. Cornelius Vandermark's vast empire was dismantled, his holdings scattered into trusts and shell companies. Yet many of the families tied to the Circle survived the scandal, their wealth cleaned and repurposed into foundations, philanthropies, and industries that helped restore their reputations. Out of the wreckage, reforms began to take root: stricter federal safety regulations, protections for organized labor, and the creation of investigative mechanisms capable of following these crimes across state lines. The story of the Circle became a touchstone for a new generation of journalists and investigators, determined never again to allow such unchecked power to thrive in the shadows. Evangeline's fight also left a cultural legacy. Her archive, her journal, and her ultimate sacrifice inspired others to take up the cause she had died for. Though her efforts came too late to save those who were silenced by the Circle's cruelty, her work forced open a door that could not be closed. In the decades that followed, her name came to symbolize the kind of unrelenting moral courage that changes history. Her story also underscores a painful truth about her time: the particular danger faced by a woman who dared to challenge a male-dominated system built to protect itself. Evangeline had used the very privilege of her marriage to gain access to the world she intended to destroy, and for that, she paid the ultimate price. She had turned what was meant to be her cage into a weapon, and though she was murdered before she could see the results, the evidence she left behind forced a reckoning that reshaped an industry and the nation itself. The disappearance of Evangeline Vandermark began as a whispered scandal, a puzzle no one dared to solve. Decades later, her voice spoke again through the dust and silence of a forgotten chamber, revealing how far power and greed can corrupt, and how a single determined individual can shake the foundations of an empire. And so, we are left with questions. Was everything revealed? Or do the shadows of America's industrial past still conceal secrets, the remnants of conspiracies that have simply adapted to a modern age? Could a circle armed with global reach and modern technology still exist today, unseen but shaping the world as surely as it did over a century ago? If this story left you unsettled, share it with someone who loves a mystery where history and horror intertwine. Subscribe for more stories that blur the line between fact and nightmare, and let us know in the comments. Do you think the Pittsburgh Circle is truly gone, or just waiting for another opportunity to rise? Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.